Welcome, everybody. My name is Elijah Siegler. I'm a proud member of KKB Synagogue. So hi to all KKB adult education peeps. Thanks for being here. I'm also a professor of religious studies at the College of Charleston, and I know there's some College of Charleston students here. Thanks for coming, guys. Hope you guys can stay to the end and ask some provocative questions. So
Are they graded by provocativeness, Elijah? Do they get more points the more provocative their question is?
Yes, and I get to judge who's the most provocative. KKB is hosting us here. Hosting the Zoom talk, so thank you for that. And they were going to be hosting the in-person talk when this had been scheduled for an in-person lecture in their beautiful sanctuary, and hosting a reception in the social hall after. But if you haven't, for those of you who live in Charleston and haven't yet been to KKBE, it's definitely worth visiting. But our special guest, Dr. Rosen, had some kind of difficult situations, and so was unable to fly down to Charleston from his home in Maine, but we're so grateful that he's able to join us for Zoom for this talk. And it's going to be a great talk. It'll probably be about, what do you think, Aaron, like 45 minutes?
Yeah, we'll do sort of 45 minutes to an hour, and I'll judging by your faces, I'll sort of scan the room, as it were, and see what attention we have. But I don't like to go over an hour on Zoom, and I like to be talking at you, and I like to have the opportunity to take questions, and I'll stay till the bitter end to answer any questions.
Yes, yeah. So please stay. We can go all night with all these questions after this provocative talk. As you know, this talk is being recorded. In a couple of days, it'll be available here. I just threw it into the chat, vimeo.com/KKBE, if you want to rewatch it or send it to people who couldn't make it. This is not only is KKBE kind of supporting this talk, but two other organizations were instrumental in kind of arranging Dr. Rosen's now virtual visit to Charleston. And if you don't know about these organizations, these are amazing local nonprofit Charleston groups. One is the Charleston Interreligious Council, and the president of that is here at the top, Dina Moses. She's waving over there. You see Dina. There's the website I just threw on there, cicouncil.org. Sign up for email alerts. We've got all kinds of great programming involving talks that deal with a multiple of religious tradition to promote kind of mutual understanding and education. So if you don't know about CI Council, please do join that group. It's a Charleston-based organization. The other Charleston organization that helped bring Dr. Rosen here and also does amazing programming is called the Foundation for Spirituality and the Arts. And their website is fsa.art. fsa.art. I just threw that in the chat room. The director and founder of that group is here today, Tyler Rollins. He's waving at you all. You see him in his box. So again, go to their website, sign up for their email newsletters, do all kinds of interesting work. And often the FSA and the CIC collaborate. For example, on the Spirited Brunch, which is happening on April 23rd, that's kind of a collaboration involving art, religion, food, all the good things in life. And of course, KKBE has been a participant in that since day one. So sign up for both of those organizations. So now is my time. Normally I would introduce the speaker. I would talk about all of Dr. Rosen's great accomplishments, his publications, his honors. I'm not going to do any of that because I want to give him the most amount of time. You can read all about that here in his the website of the center that he directs in Washington, D.C., or his personal art gallery that he runs from in Maine. So click on that. You can learn all about Dr. Rosen. I'll just say that after spending some time looking at his work, I'm just so struck by how he really stands at the intersection of so many important fields, the intersection of academic and popular scholarship, the intersection of the study of religion and the study of visual culture. So we're really excited to have him talk about a book that isn't even out yet. It's after you hear this talk, you want to rush out and order this book. I think it comes out in June. But let me shut up and just give a big, everyone please give a big Charleston welcome to Dr. Aaron Rosen. Yay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elijah, and look forward to hoping that this will be the start of something and the opportunity to come and visit you folks in person in the future. But it's great to have the chance to talk in this format, one of the few blessings that the internet provides. I think there's definitely some dark, grimy sides of the internet, and the opportunity to talk with a bunch of very interesting people, very accomplished people, and hosted by brilliant organizations is one of the positive sides of the internet. So it's not all just deep fakes. Or am I a deep fake right now? Who knows? We'll find out. So I want to dig right in. And so I'll do the screen sharing here and just make sure that we've got that cooking just as well as we need it to. So you'll be able to see that there. And now we'll just go in this way. All righty, folks. So this talk is called What Would Jesus See? And so I thought I'd invite you, if you want, to put into the chats what you see in this picture to start with, a little trick out of the school teacher playbook. But one of the things that so happens with books, and some of you may know this as authors of books, and some of you may not, is that there's a lot happens with negotiations with different bodies about everyone weighing in what will be most marketable. Of course, as the author, you always think that you have the best idea for a book. I've picked notoriously bad covers in the past, so I was happy that the publisher took my best suggestion, not my worst suggestions on this one. And this is a painting by Roger Wagner, an artist that I'm friends with over in the UK. And I thought it kind of sets in motion for us a lot of interesting things that I want to talk about today. So as you'll see here, you see the video camera, you can see someone taking a video on a cell phone, and it just automatically tosses us into this collision. It's almost like it's been painted for this book. This collision between the Jesus of the first century, who sort of gives birth to that century in a way, historically, and the Jesus who I'm prognosticating about, the Jesus who I'm taking out of the Gospels as literature and bringing into the present and saying, what would that Jesus of the past think about this particular moment in the present? And of course, one of the things I like here is that we've got a kippah on this Jesus. So we have a Jewish Jesus, so that also felt reflective of the stance that I was coming to this book from. And that's one of the interesting things about writing a book about Jesus as a Jew. There's a whole cottage industry of Jews writing books on Jesus, but pretty much everyone has been asked at one point whether they're a Jew for Jesus and where they really stand on things. And so it always takes a little bit of work at the first to offer a preamble that yes, I am a practicing Jew, but with a deep interest in Jesus. The other thing you might notice here is that there's no question mark. That was a publisher's decision. They thought that a question mark would look too evangelical, which I thought was the most curious and interesting comment I've received when I was coming up with the idea for the book early on, because as a practicing Jew with some agnostic tendencies here and there, I must say I've seldom been called too evangelical and too Christian. So that was rather intriguing. So you can judge for yourselves, but I would say that this talk really invites you to insert the question mark, and hopefully we'll have a lot of time for questions and debate in what follows. Now, here's a question that's dedicated to my Nana Rosen. What's a good Jewish boy doing being so interested in Jesus? We visited her in hospital. She's just 99, and we visited her the other day, and my aunt accidentally reminded her that I'm married to a priest, which was suboptimal, and set off a series of awkward conversations. So I am, as I said, a practicing Jew, but my wife is an Episcopal priest. And so that is, that animates a lot of my discussions about interfaith dialogue. And we even live in a parsonage here on the Maine coast. And my next book will be called a Jew in the parsonage. So there's these different elements that sort of come into play here. Now, in addition to this personal side of things, as I mentioned, a lot of Jewish scholars have written books about Jesus. And of course, there's also a layer of important Jewish scholars who have written books about other Jews writing books about Jesus. So multiple layers of sort of Russian dolls, as it were. And one of my favorite and I think most impressive in this, this litany is Susanna Heschel, of course, the daughter of Rabbi Heschel, who's quite famous to many of us for his work in social justice and work on the prophets. And Susanna Heschel talks about the need for reversing the gaze and how interesting it was for early Jewish reformers like Rabbi Abraham Geiger to look back at Jesus, and in some ways they made some problematic assumptions, folks like Geiger, but they cleared space for Jewishness, and were able to utilize Jesus as a sort of canvas for working out ideas about Jewishness in a largely Christocentric world, especially as it was in the 19th century when Jews are still coming into the opportunity to have full rights as citizens in Europe in particular. And so I see my work as falling within this wider tradition of reversing the gaze. And the way I've reversed it in particular was always been visually. I'm really a scholar of religion and visual culture at my heart. And my first book was called Imagining Jewish Art. And you can tell the kind of things I do by the fact that it's not just Jewish art, it's imagining it. I didn't want to go looking for Jewishness where it was most obvious and most present. And I was content with the accusation, as one reviewer put it once, that one chapter seemed to be largely fictionalized. I was like, yes, that's what I'm doing. That is theology to me. I am sort of actually conjecturing about what I would imagine could be happening in a Chagall painting, not always saying exactly what I think Chagall was doing. And a real lodestar for me was Asher Lev, and a book that I'm sure many of you have read. And if you're students or you haven't read it yet, it's an absolute timeless classic. And there's a great scene in there of this Orthodox Jewish boy, Asher Lev, who has this brilliant talent for painting. And his mentor, Jake Kahn, says to him, when he's uncomfortable visiting the Met, if you want it, and you can see the quote there, if you want to just paint pictures of little rabbis, go ahead, but that's not what the world of art is. You have to be invested in this world that will have nudes, for instance, that make them uncomfortable, but especially crucifixions. You have to be willing to tackle these great Christian subjects, ironically, to be a great Jewish artist. And so I was really intrigued by that dynamic. And that sort of started me off on this journey a long time ago of investigating elements of interreligious dialogue and also of the relationship with Jesus as he appears truly at the core of Western culture. And one thing to just notice here, and you could read more about this painting, some of my other work, but here you have Jesus, and right alongside him, almost in the role of John the Baptist, is Chagall. And what's he doing? He's pointing to Jesus as John the Baptist would, but he's doing it with his paintbrush, and he has his palette with him. And so he's really establishing a relationship with Jesus, which is not just about persecution and Jesus as a symbol of Jewish suffering, but Jesus as a way to work out how Chagall sees himself in relation to all the other great artists through history who have painted the crucifixion. So this is him finding his way of relationship to figures like Rembrandt or Grunewald. And so it's that creative freedom, both aesthetically and theologically, that really motivated me at first to be interested in thinking about this relationship with Jesus. Now, a few risky photographs for this day. We'll get to those in a second. I couldn't help myself. So how did I come up with this title? Well, when I was first talking with a publisher, we talked a lot about this idea of what would Jesus do, which was such a big campaign of all these bracelets in the 90s and things like this. And I really wanted to recover what I think is this sort of the sting or the charge of that as a radical question, the way Dr. King and other great social reformers have answered that question of what would Jesus do. And I thought to do so, I needed to really pivot things from just saying, what would Jesus do, which really oftentimes becomes a kind of another way of saying, what would I do, to a question of what would Jesus see? And of course, when you do that, then people might say, well, Jesus wasn't a looker. Well, who knows how Jesus looked? There's a great book by my friend Joan Taylor of What Did Jesus Look Like? So you could always read that. The answer is we don't know a ton, but pretty average. So he wasn't a looker in that sense, but people might say, was he too much of a he's obsessed with doing, of course. He's teaching us what we should or can do in the world. So isn't seeing just a kind of a marginal part of that? And one of the great causes of my so-called career is to really convince people that looking is serious work, and it's serious ethical work. And that when we think we're just talking about optics, we're almost always talking about ethics. And when we think we're talking about ethics, a good deal of the time we're talking about optics. So as I've written in op-eds and other places, I sort of like to use this indictment of Jesus to the Pharisees, indicting them as blind guides and saying, you strain out a gnat but swallow a camel, which is such a brilliant image, and apply that to contemporary circumstances to show that we actually really do know when we see things that are inauthentic or really quite monstrous in terms of optics. And that's we know implicitly that this is not what Jesus would want to see, to add a letter to the acronym. And so here is this, to me, rather horrifying image of Donald Trump thinking he's a basketball star, lobbing paper towels into the crowd, and inviting them to the lucky winner to catch this. And in the background, of course, in this beautiful shot, we see God bless, and we also see the cross. And so we have this really strong, to my mind, divergence between foreground and background, although perhaps for others, a confluence between this messianic figure of Trump and the cross. And Kanye West, I would say, probably not a hero for too many of us Jews at the moment. And here he is with his self-glorifying mythology of Jesus and his the way he blends his name Kanye or Ye with Ye and Jesus. And but a little bit harder to see here is he's actually also wearing a "What Would Jesus Do" bracelet. Of course he is. And of course, Jesus would be just like Kanye, wouldn't he? No, definitely not. But what I wanted to do in the book was offer some kind of examples like this, but then pivot us to think about things where they get a little more complex. And the real thesis of the book is that Jesus is a visual thinker. It's a bit modish of me to say, but a visual thinker. And so what does that mean? Well, I think that Jesus is consummately aware of the optics of every single thing he's doing. And not only is he aware how it could be construed or misconstrued, what he's doing, he manipulates vision in really beautiful, strange, and interesting ways. And we think, and there's ways in which artists have cottoned on to that. There's a beautiful painting of the Sermon on the Mount by Claude Lorraine, and that's referenced here in this reconception of that, and this gigantic work of multiple panels by David Hockney called A Bigger Message. And one thing that's really interesting here is that the shepherds are looking at Jesus teaching. And so there's a sense that even though they probably can't hear from down here, they are filled and inspirited by something that he's by the way he's teaching, and that he makes of himself and lifts himself up as this example and shows his intimacy with the disciples in this way for everyone to see. So even at a time where he's lacking a megaphone here, he is still sort of teaching others who witness his teaching. So this idea of performance is really integral to how Jesus relates to people. And one of the things that Jesus absolutely insists on is acts of visible goodness, as I would put it, in a pretty basic formulation. But he says, you are the light of the world, a city built on a hill cannot be hid. Your light shines before others. So he really wants the us to let goodness radiate in a really palpable, discernible way, not just to have these, quiet, hidden acts of goodness, but to illuminate the world. And of course, when I started talking in that way of illuminating the world with goodness, I think about things like this little light of mine. And I was reminded that when my wife was in her, Carolyn was in her early career, there was a priest who really insisted that they should sing "This Little Light of Mine" at the end of every children's service. And Arthur was just one or two. We raised our son Jewish. And I just was uncomfortable with the whole thing. I wanted to show that I supported my wife and was really engaged, but I kind of hang out in the back and, clap a little bit, but definitely not my favorite song. And Carolyn really reminded me that of the history of this song, which is so powerful and important for the civil rights movement, for the Freedom Riders, for raising funds and awareness of the cause of social justice. And it was interestingly summoned in 2017 by counter-protests to the Unite the Right, anti-Semitic, anti-Black, just generally racist and horrid Charlottesville march. And people gathered together and they sang "This Little Light of Mine." And it was a wonderful antidote to the poison that was out there being spewed by the neo-Nazis. And actually their little light, as it were, becomes this kind of counter illumination to the tiki torches of the neo-Nazis. And I thought that's the kind of inclusive light that I think Jesus is really talking about when he wants us to shine our light before others, not one that sort of irradiates or surpasses everyone else in its light, but something that draws other people in rather prismatically. So how does Jesus think that vision actually works? Well, if you're George Bush and you're in a debate, you might say that Jesus is your favorite philosopher, partly because you might struggle to name other philosophers. Jesus is a good answer if you're a presidential candidate. But Jesus, of course, was not a philosopher. He was many things, and he doesn't need to be a philosopher to be brilliant, right? And one of the things I was very interested in is what might he have been influenced by, what might be in the ether, as it were, as people were thinking about vision. And one of the things we notice is that for Jesus, when he says the eye is the lamp of the body, that first of all, there's this totally integral relationship of vision to everything else, especially to your moral and physical and spiritual health. And that for the Jews of this period, we would think of the moral and the spiritual, the physical, medical, all biological, all of these things sort of wrapped together. It wouldn't make sense to try to pull out one thing and just think of ophthalmology as its own discrete discipline. That doesn't really exist in the same way. But he might have been a little bit aware of this idea of extramission versus intramission. And at the very least, we could say that he's probably in the camp of extramission. So what does that mean? That means that, little bit like this early modern print that you see here on the right, that he would have sort of fallen into the camp of Plato, who thought that eyes kind of shoot out these beams. There's like, and actually Plato refers to fire, so it's kind of interesting. So you might imagine it a little bit like the X-Men or something like this. But the way Jesus really thinks of sight is that it's traveling out from the eye to attach to the thing that it's seen, rather than a more Aristotelian perspective of intramission, where it would be that sight is really is sort of radiating to the eye from the objects themselves. They're sort of emitting something. And either way, in this extramission versus intramission, the key point is that there's connectivity, right? That it's not just that sight is this passive action or processing or recipient of stimuli, but rather that there's a connection across this effluvium or space between object and person, or person and person, and you are intimately linked to the thing you are seeing. And that helps us really understand why he says things like this quote below: everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. It doesn't say much about the other directions, but if your right eye causes you sin, tear it out and throw it away. A pretty radical prescription. And people, some people took this rather seriously. And Origen tended to take this seriously in terms of sexual urges as well, according to legend of self-castration. But that's another, you can see where this might go, that this doesn't lead to brilliant medical advice, but that there is this sense that sight really reaches out and touches other people. And so it's not just that, thinking of Jimmy Carter, our great prince there, it's not just this sort of prudishness of, one has already committed adultery just by looking in a lascivious way. It's that the act of looking is its own form of consummation. You are reaching out with your eye and touching the other person that you're beholding. And so that's an element, I think, that's sort of under-recognized when we talk about and oftentimes joke about, especially with Jimmy Carter, this idea of having committed adultery in your heart, that it's a serious thing for Jesus because it's a physicalized element and it's really phenomenological in that way. And so Jesus, in a way that actually anticipates 20th century thought, he really thinks like a phenomenologist who understands that there is a grip, as Merleau-Ponty puts it, on the world, that our vision and our senses are really entwined with the fleshliness of the world. So he's both very ancient and in some ways really very interestingly modern. So now let's get to this idea of restoring sight or redirecting the gaze. So how does this really work for Jesus in his ministry? Well, one really classic example is of what I'm calling this vision test. You're going to see it probably a lot and probably too many visual puns in the talk, but I feel like PowerPoint invites that. And he has a man who is born blind. And of course, there's a lot of debate. Did this man sin? Did his parents sin? And Jesus doesn't buy into that, which is actually great. And in order to restore his sight, he has the person who's blind rub mud from the pools of Siloam across his eyes, right? Very interesting. So it's Jesus. He could make him see instantly, right? But instead, he wants him to go through this process. He wants to have this kind of dramatic reveal, to use reality TV show parlance, right? It's really important for him also that the person believes something has been done physically, that he's sort of engaged with his eyes before they're opened. And when he does, he actually has to teach him how to see. And I find that so interesting. It very much relates to this early modern problem that the philosopher John Locke introduces, which is if someone can't see, and then they were and for him at this stage, hypothetically, were endowed with vision, what would happen? Would they be able to recognize, say, a square or a sphere? And as we know from current medical research, no, they actually have to be taught to interconnect their senses again, so that you are feeling and seeing and associating those in a neurologically in a very direct way. So that's really interesting that Jesus then, when he teaches him how to see, and it says, I'm the one speaking with you. I'm the one who saved you. I did this. I sort of imagine him touching the man and sort of helping, that his first act of reconnecting this man with his sight is multisensory, but it's also placing Jesus at the forefront and at the center of vision. Now, there's another great example. And adultery tends to be a really big theme and place for working out the complexities of vision and desire, unsurprisingly. So there's this probably late addition to the Gospels and pretty problematic and in all sorts of ways story about the woman accused of adultery whom you see here on the right. And what's interesting is that Jesus creates space. He creates a visual spectacle that draws the eyes away from the woman, right? So that now, instead of looking at her and shaming her, they're now looking at what he's writing in the dirt or in the dust in front of him. And we don't know what he's writing, actually. We never find out in the story. So which is itself really interesting. So he's in having them use their dubious sensibilities and desire to understand what's happening and pushing that away from the woman into what he's doing. and then stuns them by, asking them to cast the first stone if they're the ones without sin, as we all know this story. But then interestingly, they all sort of fall away from the scene. And then he lifts up her vision and says, women, where are they? Obviously, Jesus knows this is a rhetorical question, but he wants her to have the confidence in her own sight to see that no one is there to condemn her, right? So her eyesight is truly replenished or restored or lifted up in a way that's maybe not as physicalized, but is just as powerful as a story of the man born blind. So throughout the book, I try to give a few models of the things, the words and expressions that I think are most central to what Jesus is teaching people to do. And the number one thing I think that Jesus wants is for people to pay attention. So how do we pay attention? We'll have to check and see how many people we lose off the Zoom. That's one register, right? So here, it's hard to pay attention in very different media. And Robert Putnam, an important sociologist, talks about the sort of luminous enemy within of television, and how it is that of all the different things to explain the loss of social capital and connectedness, one of the big things may just be that everyone's, instead of going to the bowling alley or going to the Rotary Club, they are watching television. And of course, that gets far, far worse with the internet. And of all the things that people are obsessed with about TikTok in the current hearings, just how corrosive it is to attention spans is really probably not the central thing for them, but nonetheless, one that's a really signal moment of our times. So how do we, in a world that's demanding our attention all these different ways, how do we keep attention in a way that Jesus would request or invite people to do so? One, I think, is that he wants us to keep vigil. He wants us to look with care. So carefully, but looking also with care. And we see that in the example of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's just about to be rounded up and taken by the Roman authorities and escorted off to the series of events that will culminate with his death. And he knows that all this is coming, and it's about to hit the fan, as it were. And all he wants for his compatriots, his disciples, the people he's chosen that should understand him the best, is to just stay with him and keep watch. So looking for threats, but also just being alert, being awake as a sign of solidarity. And 3 times they fail to do this most basic fundamental thing for him. And there's an element of comedy if you imagine this on stage, but it's really an element of pathos as well. Now, in addition to looking outward and looking with care, the other thing that Jesus invites us to do when he talks about paying attention, or I think implicitly summons these ideas, is to invite us to look inwards. And that comes out so often in multiple religious traditions. Thomas Merton talked about this idea of keeping awake and attentive and as the core of meditation, but really as the core of the spiritual life more generally. And Merton, for those who don't know, is a Trappist monk of the mid-20th century who was very influential and was friends with Thich Nhat Hanh and the Dalai Lama and great figures across other religious traditions. And one of the great representations of staying awake, I think, is Bodhidharma. And here you have a monk a Buddhist monk who is so upset that he's falling asleep as he's staring at the wall in his cave, which he, according to legend, does for 9 years, that he cuts off his eyelids so he will never be able to go to sleep. And according to legend, so here he is without his eyelids. It really puts Van Gogh to shame. His eyelids fall to the cave floor and they sprout tea leaves, and it's these caffeinated tea leaves that will eventually, according to tradition, keep the rest of monks awake so that they are alert in their meditation. And then as a personal example, I think it's interesting to think about how the arts might focus our attention, and I talk about drawing attention. And it's this lovely quote from the philosopher Simone Weil, who can be both really insightful and really wrong on things. Attention taken to its highest degree is the same thing as prayer. It presupposes faith and love. And I thought about that a lot as in my son's early days, and I drew this picture of him. So not a brilliant drawing, of course, but I put it in just as an example of what even weak drawing can do for focusing the attention. And this was, I think it was on, maybe it was around Christmas of his first year, about 6 months. And I felt that the act of drawing gave me a much more sort of incarnate and embodied sense of him, even, before he talked, and before he, did much of anything, the kind of knowledge that my wife seemed to have intuitively from, of course, having carried him, that I might gain a little something of that via the act of drawing. Now, what are the other things that Jesus might recommend for paying attention? One is to keep our distance. So on the one hand, Jesus wants to bring us really close to him and close to one another, but Jesus even himself has his strong limits. Jesus constantly needs to replenish himself. One of the things that I picked up in Norman Mailer's Gospel According to the Son, but it's really right there in the Gospels, is that Jesus gets really tired, and he is unable to perform his miracles and do things unless he really recharges his batteries, or what millennials and Gen Z might call self-care these days. And so he needs to find space. And one of the things that keeps happening in the Gospels is we learn that he goes somewhere dark, and he goes somewhere elevated, and he goes by himself. And there seems to be something really prescient about that. And this is someone who lived in a very dark world. Nighttime was not very bright in ancient Judea as he's traveling around in the wilderness between towns. And yet, even so, Jesus has to remove himself as much as he can from anyone else. And when we think about this, we might think of more recent figures, and this is why I've put in Walden Pond and Henry David Thoreau's little cottage or cabin here in the woods. And I think this quote from Thoreau is really interesting and very theologically astute. I suspect myself and cannot help but shudder when he's in the woods, when I find myself so implicated even in what are called good works. So whatever you're doing in nature, those are merely good works. So in a Christian sense, they are not grace. So what you need to open yourself to is to this undeserved, unmerited opportunity to commune with something higher and deeper than yourself through grace, more than just good works. So even if you're thinking about doing good works or doing the right thing to the right people, when you're by yourself in the woods, if you're doing that kind of thinking, you're not really attentive to nature in the way that nature calls forth and demands. And recent psychological research has really emphasized these, just how replenishing this kind of quote unquote non-directed attention can be, of carefully going around. I notice this with my son Arthur all the time, of going around on the beach and collecting shards of pottery, and the kind of close looking in the natural world, that looking can have deep physiological effects. And so it really does genuinely make people happier, to the extent that when seniors were asked to go on awe walks and take a selfie of themselves, those who are told to just, so the control group just goes and can go, and they just have to go into nature for the same amount of time, but they're not told what to look for. The other group is told to try to channel this experience of awe. And over time, the people who were asked to think about awe and wonder had better physiological results and better psychological results than the other side, right? Very interesting. And they started taking different selfies. They took selfies in which they got smaller and smaller, and the images of nature became larger and larger. So they stopped thinking about themselves in the same way. Now, another way Jesus might want us to pay attention is to be on high alert, right? He's constantly telling us about the way in which we might need to be alert to the coming of the coming of the Messiah, but and the end times, but avoiding false messiahs, right? And the problem is, and Christians have certainly found this in their history, and Jews have found the same thing, that waiting, it gets harder to stay attentive over time, to be on the highest state of alert. And we see this all the time. I've thrown up a few examples here of the Y2K panic, the Homeland Security. Remember when after 9/11, everyone was supposed to feel more safe because our country was using different rainbow colors to evoke what's more safe. And of course, who is going to ever risk putting something at low? There's no terrorism here, just to then be struck with a terrorist attack, right? So you end up basically being high or severe, as it were, all the time. And people can't live in that kind of condition. You can't have that kind of attention. And we find the same thing, I think, with the kind of exhaustion that sets in with the doomsday clock. We all wait to tune in, how close are we to destruction based on these scientists' perspective? And, oh, we've gone from 100 seconds to 90 seconds. Like, it may not take a bunch of scientists to tell us that we're increasingly screwed, right? And that we're just on the precipice of disaster. And this is one of the problems that we find with fighting long-term existential threats like climate change. But I think what Jesus invites us to do is to dip in and out of it, to remember we might not be able to sustain all of that, but there's still a merit in practicing what that stage of high alert looks like, and to imagine a kind of musical chairs where suddenly the music stops, right? That it's still worthwhile doing that in order to shed light on and focus on what's happening in the present. And he gives us this really evocative quote here of the weather. And of course, he's not thinking about climate change here, but it's hard not to read it today in relationship to climate change, that Jesus is saying, if you're a smart farmer, and everyone had to know something about agriculture back then, if these things are happening, you see the scorching wind or all these different things and the heat, et cetera, on the horizon, like, you'd be a fool not to pay attention to these things. And so Jesus wants us to pay attention. And the question is, how do we best do that? Now, another thing that Jesus wants us to do, I think, as I read him, is to discern the truth. And one of the great prophets of our time, I think, is Stephen Colbert. Open to debate on that. But I remember watching this first episode of Colbert where he talks about truthiness, where he promises to feel the news at us, right? So prophetic of the things that would get even worse out of Fox News and different media outlets over time. And of course, then we move from that kind of indictment and that cheekiness of calling something truthiness to recognizing what is fake news, and then having certain politicians like Donald Trump label things as fake news that are really actual news, and then now deep fakes. So we're in a time of, as I put it in the book, kind of a golden age for silver tongues, for mendacity. And a time that people like Susan Sontag and Hannah Arendt saw on the horizon when they were looking at imagery and replication and authenticity. So Jesus is particularly alert to what we could say the deep fakes of his time, and what is false appearances or false pieties. And one of the things he's really interested in is exposing the people who are merely presenting a facade. And of course, one of the problems that we find now is that we have what is a computer screen if not a form of a facade? And what is our telephone, our smartphone, if not a device for creating new facades constantly? And so you have so many examples from social media, but which I think give new meaning to this idea of the whitewashed tombs, this kind of whitewashing, perhaps with an ethnic significance there of whitewashing the truth. And then you have a sort of participation in this by the media climate, and you see that nicely illustrated here by an Italian social media influencer that the Uffizi brings in to show in front of their works of art, as if a Botticelli is Venus is not enough. You need Chiara Ferragni to be in front of it to show us what a contemporary God might be. So we fall prey to these kind of illusions, and it's not surprising that that this invites then tons of further selfies in front of largely religious or mythological works without much self-reflection and without real dialogue with the thing that's really in front of them. And so we're certainly at a time of risking our incapacity to really discern spiritually and aesthetically. Now, And I realized, by the way, that we're about 7:45, so we'll sort of look to wrap up in the next sort of 10 minutes or so, and I'll feed you a few more ideas, and then we'll begin to open up some questions. So the other thing that Jesus is really interested in, and so are the writers of the New Testament, is eyewitness testimony. Of course, the Gospel of Luke and others really say this was passed on by a totally reliable witness who said this to this person who said that, and so I'm relating it verbatim. And I've also conducted my investigation and talked to someone else who saw this the way it really happened. And I think if we were to apply other hermeneutics that we might in a courtroom, we might not be that impressed anymore by this idea of, oh, this really happened to Jesus in this way because someone saw it, right? One thing we know is that people have lying eyes, and in many ways, not just the country music significance, but that eyewitness accounts can be totally shaped, and they can be shaped by police, for instance. They can be shaped by people's prejudices. And we see just an absolute disturbing and terrifying number of Black men in particular incarcerated for crimes or condemned to death for crimes that they never committed based on quote unquote eyewitness testimony. And I had the privilege of working with one such artist, Ndume Olutushani, who was ultimately freed after around 20 years, who created this very powerful work about his experience with these jumpsuits, looking out to the Supreme Court from the United Methodist General Building there, just off of the mall in DC. And someone who was convicted again on testimony that was incredibly flimsy, and convicted of a crime in a state where he'd actually never visited, which is incredibly telling. Now, Jesus, on the one hand, wants to tell us that it's better to believe than to have to see for yourself, right? But on the other hand, the irony of this is that in a story like that of the doubting Thomas, as he's called, that actually he gets to see, and depending on whether you're Catholic or not, this changes, but touch, he gets to see and touch potentially the wound, and so he sees, touches, then believes. But we are asked to believe partly because he saw and of his testimony. So there's a kind of an interesting layer there that happens. And one of the things that Jesus really insists on is, he talks about being his own witness, even, which is legally very, very dubious, or his Father being his witness, is that that the strength of our conviction vouchsafes our testimony. And you can see how that could be really dubious, right? That if you just had a model of testimony that said, well, do you really, really believe this? And that was all you were looking for, you might get some skewed results. But on the one hand, while that's a problem, I think Jesus is very astute in extraordinary moments when there's tremendous pressure not to witness. Then the strength of that conviction is that countervailing force, and we see this this image of Darnella Fraser as she is doing she is taking the video of George Floyd's murder, and it's this video which she posts to Facebook, which will ultimately become the testimony that's absolutely essential in convicting Floyd's murderers. And then you also see this incredibly haunting, devastating image by the Sonderkommando, the Jews who were forced to staff the crematoria in Auschwitz. And here it is that under every imaginable pressure, it managed to sneak a camera in and sort of shoot, in many cases, from the hip or from the really here from the sort of mouth of the crematoria building to shoot the burning of gassed bodies. I mean, it's just absolutely astonishing. Interestingly, when this image was first used by resistance forces, it was then cropped so you could just see the bodies as the subject. But actually, as the philosopher George Didi Uberman points out, what's really perhaps most interesting is the fact that we see the person seen, we see the act of witness, and we know from this the extraordinary danger and how veiled and cloaked they have to be to even take this photo. Now, above all, Jesus wants us to recognize others. And that seems really simple, right? But the problem is that he wants us to pay attention to difference, but he doesn't, I think, necessarily want us to reify that. So what does that mean? I think that means in cases like seeing ethnic difference, racial difference, for instance, that he gives us tools to think through the fact that people's embodied experiences of racism are completely real, but there's room to talk about how race is itself a construct, something that's been, brilliantly insightfully put in the book Racecraft, that it's really a staging of discourse that creates modern ideas of what any particular race is, not to deny at all the lived reality of people who are people of color, right? But in fact, to actually say that the construction of their identity by outside forces imposes an identity, a discourse around race that becomes their lived physical, emotional, spiritual reality. And Jesus is interested, I think, in giving us tools to recognize people in their difference, but at the same time insisting on something that is so deep, it goes beneath all sort of attributes, right? And this is why I talk about Jesus's preferred pronoun, as it were, of being you, that Jesus sees people and recognizes, but without preconception. So recognizing seems like you recognize something because you've seen it before, you've seen the person before, right? But actually what Jesus is able to do, and I don't think this is replicable, but it's a great goal, is to see and know and have known someone, but without having preconceived ideas about them. So that's a really interesting challenge for us ethically. And the act of seeing people means that Jesus really invites them to become themselves in his presence. So it's not just that they are who they are, it's they become in some ways the best version of themselves, but also the version that they most need to encounter. So even in their ostensible sins, as we see as Matthew as the tax collector, he's really becoming and seeing himself through Jesus seeing him in this moment. And we see this in the stories of the calling of Jesus's disciples. It's like he's having a pickup basketball game. He just literally sees people essentially on the street, or in this case, the beach, sees them fishing, and he tells them, I'll make you fish for people. I don't think these fisher Jews of the first century probably knew what being fishers of men exactly meant. That's for us to understand later, this bit of foreshadowing, but they just simply feel seen in a really deep, profound way. And so that's the kind of dynamic that I think that Martin Buber recognizes when he really lifts up Jesus as this example of someone who has I-you relationships, that Jesus sees and speaks to people as truly as a you. And I think this gets us to the crux of many of our these social debates right now about pronouns, that the key thing is that by recognizing people by the pronoun that is their reality, how they want to be called, that is the way of saying you to them, of seeing and relating to them in a deep, profound way. And so it's kind of ironic and really sad at the moment that Jesus is invoked as a way of not seeing people for the way they see themselves. And as we come to wrap up, just in the last couple minutes here, one of the things that we think about is, how is it that we show mercy? And as the great African-American theologian Howard Thurman said in Jesus and the Disinherited, a hugely influential book for civil rights leaders, that there's a danger of being simply good Samaritans who haven't really changed the way we see. That there can be a way of, as he puts it, that vitiates the missionary impulse, that there's a self-righteousness and a superiority, even as you're doing the right thing, even as you're helping people. And I'm giving we won't tackle everything here. We'll, the final example here of falling short, that this is such a hard thing to do that even Jesus screws this up. And this amazing passage from Mark, that Jesus takes the Syrophoenician woman who is says, please, will you help me? And he says, no, this is for the why would I give the scraps to the dogs to someone who's not an Israelite, who doesn't deserve these things? And she said, but even, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Give me something to go back to my daughter who's in pain, who has these demons, right? Give me something for her. And Jesus makes this about face. And part of that is that her very lowliness is what allows him to see the authenticity of what she's asking. And her position, as it were, under the table is what empowers her to ask this question of Jesus, and what allows him to recognize that. And now the final slide here. What happens when Jesus gets resurrected? Well, it's really strange. He has an encounter with Mary, and she thinks it's the gardener. So we have no idea what's happening in the scene. It's really complex and interesting. And one thing that might be happening there is that, maybe Jesus is, his senses are scrambled by the fact that he's been brought to life. Maybe he doesn't recognize her. And that's why maybe it's not that he's just being coy and sort of playing along as the gardener, as we see in this famous scene by Titian, the Noli Me Tangere. But the interesting thing is that Jesus is being seen by Mary, ultimately recognized as teacher. She calls out to him as Rabboni. He is being seen for who he is, again, in this deep core way that is beyond just the sort of accidents or incidents of merely how he looks, right? So she recognizes him as himself in a way that is not so contingent on, as it were, mere appearances. And then he goes and has supper with his friends at Emmaus, and they're really doubtful that this is really Jesus. And it's really when he kind of says to them, can anyone get a bite to eat? Where can a guy get a bite to eat around here? It's when he eats with them that he convinces them that, first of all, that he's not a ghost, which is really important for Jewish ideas at that time. But it's that they are able to see him as their friend, not just as it were, the Messiah. So he is both ultimately this person who's come back from the dead, but he's also the person that they knew in this really intimate way that they recognize them. And the final idea to leave you with is one from the African-American theologian James Cone, which is that the most important recognition really coming out of this reading of the Gospels is to learn to see not just Jesus better, of course, but looking through Jesus's eyes to learn to see, as Cone puts it, the crucified bodies in our midst. And he is particularly thinking in this quote here of the lynching tree and the scores of victims of these terrible crimes, and that really learning to look at the lynching tree in an unflinching way helps us actually to understand the crucifixion in a deeper way, that we go back and forth between the image of the crucifixion and the lynching tree and the cross, and that they both interpret one another in a deep way. And so what Jesus is ultimately calling us to do is it's this deepest act of recognition of people in pain. And for me, in writing this book, my wife asked me at the end, whether I really recognized Jesus better after this book. And the take home for me was actually that Jesus remains really strange. And that was the part that I did not want to lose in having tried to explicate this for you a little bit. And also in writing the book, What Would Jesus See? Was to remember that Jesus's vision is a strange and disorienting one, a disorienting way of looking at a disorienting world and jarring us out of our familiar pieties and preconceptions. And ultimately, the work is to us to be able to fill in the picture. So thank you very much. And I really look forward to taking questions as soon as I learn how to stop my screen share.
All right, thank you, Aaron, so much. So as I put in the chat, however you guys most want to, you can type something in the chat. You can raise your hand and put your camera on if anyone has any questions. let's keep going. I'm just gonna go by who I see. I see Rowan who typed something. Do you want to ask that, or do you want me to ask it for you, Ron? And then I also see Jake Podber raised his hand, so I'm gonna call on you in a sec. We've got some nice comments coming in.
All right, so let's see. Would like to know if other topics of Jesus consciousness interrelated with other religions and practices could... Oh yeah, absolutely. I think and one of the things that I'm really interested in the book is to frame dilemmas that I think Jesus has, and then find a way to relate those to other traditions. And that's really core to my way of practicing theology. And so I think about, for instance, I'd have a little section in one chapter called Invisible Ink, which is how do you know when you're seeing something that's really there versus that's sort of an esoteric truth versus something that's just a conspiracy theory, right? So kind of compare, how do you know that you're not just being Q, right? And from QAnon and all that junk, right? And so I kind of introduced the idea of Maimonides in Jewish tradition from the Middle Ages, that things might be inscrutable and there might be many layers of interpretation, but the words don't matter. The words are there. Jesus, we might say, and I would say Maimonides says something similar, wants us to read between the lines, but for QAnon, there's no lines anymore. So you're not doing any reading, right? And so I oftentimes find myself framing the way Jesus thinks with other religious thinkers, for sure. Do you want to, let's see, I'll read one of the next questions there. Why would Jesus only urge us to look at what is frightful? That is beautiful in the world. Absolutely. Great question. So I was pressed for time, and I'm such a cynical, horrible person that I focused on the despair rather than the hope. And in the book, I actually forced myself to do a little bit more with hope. And I look at Jürgen Moltmann's foundational work on the theology of hope. And that for him, Jesus presents a vision of hope which is tangible. It's not a utopia, as he puts it. It's not a non-place. It's in the place, because Jesus is already making hope tangible and real through his embodied presence. Now, I find that to be something that's incredibly powerful for Christians. It's less helpful for me as a Jew. And so I think that's why I focus on the stuff that I find relatable outside of an axiomatic faith position. But absolutely, to tell the story of Jesus without hope would be would probably be a disservice. Thank you for that. Was there a particular moment that inspired the book? Definitely needed to pay rent. There was, I've been thinking about what I wanted to do next, and I had written this book, Art and Religion in the 21st Century, and I felt like I was kind of getting a bit of more, known or whatever, if that's worth, for writing about contemporary art. And I wanted to test myself and say, yeah, but can I write books without just a bunch of art in it, where I'm kind of parasitically using the images of others to establish the plot lines for me? Can I come up with those plot lines myself? And can I position myself as more of this cultural critic? And I started taking a page out of the book of friends like Brent Plate, a great writer, and thinking to just in this wider way about material culture. And at the same time, the publisher said, it's not great to have to spend all the money on images. Maybe you just give some examples. So I started thinking in that direction, and I got really interested in wanting to say, I complain about things on the internet all the time. So I felt like maybe it'd be useful to say something constructive about the material and visual culture that I see in technology. So it was kind of a challenge to myself. And also to get to the stage in my Judaism where I felt like I could talk about Jesus without worrying too much, and have something that that might speak to my family in different ways. That's the book is Racecraft Asherah is the book to look at, and I'm happy to provide and I'm happy for anyone to email me if there's anything I mentioned that you want to know more about. Thinkers about vision and perception to draw upon. Where did you find the most useful resources? Yeah, thank you for that question. I found that, and actually it dovetails so nicely with this other question about Berger. So I actually, someone said to me, an editor, why don't you write a book like John Berger's Ways of Seeing? I was like, oh yes, I should just toss off a little classic like that. But I took that seriously in a way, and and one of the things that I found really powerful was his work on advertising and how we create a sort of envy of ourselves as we wish ourselves to be. And it's so prescient for the way in which we're sold things in a commercial context currently. And so I was very influenced by that. I think, I put down at the start of the talk, Susanna Heschel and other Jewish scholars. I had a lot of discussions with my seminary students and with my colleagues in New Testament. And I called a lot of New Testament scholars to say, is this okay? Is this out to lunch? Was really influenced by Joan Taylor's book, What did Jesus look like? And so it was infused by interest in the historical Jesus. But ultimately, I decided that if I was to go down the road of the historical Jesus, I would, first of all, that would be the end of my life. I would just spend 10 years reading books specifically about that. And so what I wanted to do was take scriptural passages and sort of exfoliate them, bring them into, rub them up against other things and put them in contemporary context. And so oftentimes the kind of thinking I did was related to contemporary thinkers, like I mentioned, James Cone, and people that are interesting theologians, and using that to frame what I was doing rather than just New Testament scholars or scholars of Jesus, right? Bart Ehrman and other great scholars of the first century and of Jesus, but I wanted to make sure I didn't do that because I knew I'd never really be qualified to do that. And I read a lot of commentaries. I mean, of the writing of commentaries, there is no end. So,
it's about 8:10 right now, so I think maybe we can kind of formally end, but we're not gonna, I don't think, Aaron, if you want to stick around,
sure, I'm happy to stick around. Sure.
Have more, but let's kind of make this the kind of like thank everyone for being here. Take a look at Aaron's books and join all these great organizations that help bring Aaron to Charleston, at least virtually, and look out for him maybe sometime coming here in person. We will certainly let you know.
Yes, well, now you've had a taster. Now you know the try before you buy, right? So there you go.
We're coming back. Look, again, if anyone wants to stick around, we can go all night here.
Thank you, folks. And I see a lot of friends, a lot of artists and cool people. Thank you for coming. Now, that's a really interesting question from Ashra about gender. I mean, I thought about that a fair amount. I think there's some really interesting stuff that's been written in recent years exploring whether gender expression and whether there was I think it was at Cambridge in my alma mater that there was something like a liturgy exploring the idea of Jesus being trans, which to me is not really that radical, but it's hard to shock me. And so someone said, "Oh, this is so horrible. It just, shattered my faith." I always think how fragile people's faith is if they think of hearing one sermon with one idea they don't agree with is enough to just send them into a tailspin. But I think that's really interesting, especially when we talk about embodied seeing, right? That's going to really determine so much. I did think a little bit about Leo Steinberg and the sexuality of Christ, and it was something that I thought about going further into. But and of course he doesn't think about trans identity yet, but he calls attention to representations of Jesus which show so much of Jesus's genitalia. And one of the things that's interesting, as Steinberg points out, is he calls it the sexuality of Christ in modern oblivion, which is that we don't want to look at for certain things, even when they're really obvious. When Jesus's penis, sometimes erect, is literally staring at us right in the face, we still don't want to see that, and we don't want to talk about that. And so I think that, you might apply lessons from that to thinking about Jesus as non-binary, for instance. And there's a lot of reason to suspect that Jesus is very interested in interpersonal relationships, but if he was more interested in sexuality, he would have talked a lot more about that. That is not the major thrust of what Jesus wants to put across, right? It's actually really this sort of hypocrisy, the duplicity, taking the log out of your own eye, rather than focusing on the speck that's in someone else's. I think that Jesus would be most interested probably in interrogating the anti-trans community for their perceived pieties than he would be of imposing ideas of sexuality. That said, he's still a product of the first century. So there's Jesus as we would want him to be, central to his own message, faithful to his own message, as it were, and Jesus as the product of a current context. And as we know from Jewish writers on scholarship about Paul in particular, that some of the dubious legacies of homophobia and things really come from the Hebraic side more than the Hellenistic side. So we have a lot to excavate there. Whether Jesus is a philosopher, I think it's that I think it's really one of discourse. I don't see these things so divided anymore. I think it's about the register of the discourse that you're talking about. Emmanuel Levinas, the great Jewish philosopher, was also really a great theologian. He just wanted the credibility of speaking within oftentimes in a philosophical discourse, to be in dialogue with certain types of people, of French intellectuals. But then he could switch gears and be finding the same idea through his Talmudic readings. And so he was able to talk within these different discourses. And I think if you're brilliant, then that's conceivably possible. And I tend to see the humanities as so interdisciplinary now that you can ask the same question using just different methodological tools to get there. And I think that, I think in Jesus's case that he's not consciously tapping philosophical ideas. He's tapping ideas that are coming out of the heritage of the Hebrew Bible and the religious groups of his time, right? The Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes. There's elements of these different groups that you can see affinities there with Jesus's thinking. So he's not thinking about Plato and Aristotle, but it doesn't mean that that these ideas aren't there in the ether. And for some people, Jesus is a philosopher. It's only a problem if people don't know other philosophers, and that their idea of making Jesus the most important person in history, which he rightfully is in Christianity. He really is the most important person in all of world history for Christians, right? Obviously. That saying that doesn't mean you have to also say that Jesus is the best philosopher, that he's the best thinker. That doesn't have to be the most supreme compliment, right? That he might also be limited by his time, by the different that he chooses in Christian theology to make himself subject to the demands of living in a specific time, in a specific place, in a specific body. And so he's going to be limited. And that doesn't mean that that's not a negative. That's God's choice to be incarnate in that way.
Well, can I address that now that there's a smaller group?
Yes.
Maybe. Aaron, that was amazing. It's so great to see you. Thank you so much for
pleasure
doing this talk. In regards to that, I'm really glad that the question of time and the message of time came up, because I do think a lot of people really constantly put religion in this kind of negative space, because they expect it to sort of address all time. And while in its essence, it does, in its essence, if you peel all of it away, the message does address all time, because they're universal messages based on how the cosmos are created, and not just human beings. But, for example, Muhammad actually, people don't want to recognize that as a prophet. He said to his people that that you will have to move with times. Like all of this has to actually be worked through time and adjust based on what comes next, the advances of human society and everything else. And of course, you know, that's ignored. I did just want to take a minute to ask you about just because I know your work and I admire it so much because you've written about art and religion and relationship of artists, contemporary artists of our time and their connection to various religious heritages and their traditions and their relevance, their practical relevance from the perspective of spirituality at the intersection of art and religion. And I was so happy to, of course, see that there's obviously a lot more work of art that we're going to see, in this book. But could you just maybe elaborate a little bit about what to expect when it comes to artists and sort of more access to practices of artists through this as well, and its relationship to your other passion, which is art?
Yeah. Thanks, Lisa. I mean, I couldn't help myself. And actually at one point, one of my friends was like, people might want to hear you write about art since that's what you're actually good at. I was like, one of my friends who was reading the book, and I was like, yeah, maybe I should do more, so as it goes, in the end, the final chapter, I do more with visual artists, and I get particularly interested in that chapter in contemporary African-American artists and some people that I've had that I've interviewed for Image Journal, which everyone should get, a kind of fun literary magazine. And I was looking at the work of Jared Thorne and his photograms, this series of reversing of taking the coroner's reports of murdered African-American men murdered by police and then doing them as light boxes, and really interesting ways then in which it showcases the sort of prejudices encoded into even the way the body is depicted. It's a really white physiognomy of the cadaver in the diagram, these kind of things. And so just simple but beautiful traumatic work. And I was thinking about Antonio McAfee, an artist that I work with a lot at my gallery, the Parsonage, and that I've shown in DC at the Luce Center. And I think I was really interested in his exploration of Stations of the Cross, of thinking about his brother who was killed in Baltimore, and then using as the basis for that Barnett Newman's Stations of the Cross. And it's such a synthesis and exploration of Jewish Black trauma, and it combines so many different things. And I think that kind of complexity always just really attracts me. And I'm finding right now that I'm doing a lot more with ecology. So this book, I started to deal more with in environmental studies, and that was really eye-opening for me. I started doing that in my Art and Religion, a 21st Century book, but that was written in 2015, and already I feel like I need to go back and totally do more with that. And so this book was an opportunity to figure out what I thought about some of those things, which is a great reason to write books. You want to it is convenient and awesome if people read them, but it's also just nice to figure out what on earth you're thinking. And so I was doing. So I think it's really, for me, the sort of leading edges right now are ecological and in terms of social justice. And so that's what I'll see myself writing about more. But the next book I'm actually talking with a publisher about right now is one, well, I always have a bunch of books on the go, but one is called about hospitality of images, modern art and interfaith dialogue, with chapters on things like monochromes and monotheism, and like what do you do with an Ad Reinhardt. But then this other book is going to be called A Jew in the Parsonage, and that's really about material culture. And I found myself recently very interested in that book, this Jew in the Parsonage, about sort of living in this historic parsonage owned by a major abolitionist minister, that they were the aunt and uncle of Winslow Homer. And so I started looking at Winslow Homer all over again, someone I never gave nearly enough credit to, even though he's probably the most important American artist ever. I still didn't know enough about him. And so my tastes are pretty eclectic, and I'm really changing in that way. So I find myself going deeper into American history at the same time as getting really, really contemporary. You also mentioned, that at the start of your comment about change within context, and I think that's a really important point. One of the things that we see over and over again in religious traditions is the denial that change is happening, right? And it works out, and sometimes it's brilliantly conceived, like it is in Judaism, that no, this thing that you think is this evolving element, no, that was always there, right? The counterintuitive claim that it's the oral Torah, and I think things can be counterfactual in incredibly brilliant, engaging ways. But as scholars, of course, it is useful to see this social situatedness. And I'm always aware, especially in what would Jesus see? It's subjunctive. What is he going to see? I mean, there's no way. You could, I think, still get it wrong, totally wrong. But I'm contenting myself with probably only being partially wrong, that in terms of bringing Jesus into the present. And it's that kind of exploration of just plunking him in a different context. Because I think by decontextualizing and recontextualizing him, we see our own moment more clearly, but we also see our own preconceptions about Jesus in his period more clearly as well, by that sort of active removal. And also, I'm not an archaeologist, so I knew I wasn't probably going to find anything that I could, this is it. This is Jesus' sandal. I found it. Yes, this book is going to be a success. So I knew that wasn't the right direction.
Thank you.